British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson spoke to members of the House of Commons one day after President Trump announced the U.S. would withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. He told members the U.K. had no intention of walking away from the deal, despite the U.S. decision. Members asked about future relations with the U.S., President Trump's upcoming visit to London, and whether the Iran decision would impact commercial interests between British companies and Iran. This is just under an hour.
To the ministerial statement, I will call the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Right Honourable Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will make a statement on the future of the Iran nuclear agreement, officially known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The government regrets the decision of the US administration to withdraw from the deal and to reimpose American sanctions on Iran. We did our utmost to prevent this outcome. From the moment that President Trump's administration took office, we made the case for keeping the JCPOA at every level. Last Sunday, I traveled to Washington and repeated this country's support for the nuclear agreement in meetings with Secretary Pompeo, Vice President Pence, National Security Advisor Bolton, and others. And my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, spoke to President Trump last Saturday. The US decision makes no difference to the British assessment that the constraints imposed on Iran's nuclear ambitions by the JCPOA remain vital for our national security and the stability of the Middle East. Under the agreement, Iran has relinquished 95% of its low-enriched uranium, placed two-thirds of its centrifuges in storage, removed the core of its heavy water reactor, and thus closing off the plutonium route to a bomb, and allowed the International Atomic Energy Agency to mount the most intrusive and rigorous inspection regime ever devised, an obligation on Iran that lasts until 2040. The House should not underestimate the impact of these measures. The interval needed for Iran to make enough weapons-grade uranium for one nuclear bomb is known as the breakout time. Under the deal, Iran's breakout time has trebled or even quadrupled from a few months to at least a year, and the plutonium pathway to a weapon has been blocked completely. For as long as Iran abides by the agreement, and the IAEA has publicly reported its compliance, Iran's compliance, 9 times so far, then Britain will remain a party to the JCPOA. I remind the House that the JCPOA is an international agreement painstakingly negotiated over 13 years under both Republican and Democratic institutions and enshrined in UN Resolution 2231. Britain has no intention of walking away. Instead, we will cooperate with the other parties to ensure that while Iran continues to restrict its nuclear program, then its people will benefit from sanctions relief in accordance with the central bargain of the deal. I cannot yet go into detail on the steps we propose to take, but I hope to make them available as soon as possible, and I spoke yesterday to my French and German counterparts. In his statement on January 12th, President Trump highlighted important limitations of the JCPOA, including the fact that some constraints on Iran's nuclear capacity expire in 2025. Britain worked alongside France and Germany to find a way forward that would have addressed the President's concerns and allowed the US to stay in the JCPOA, but without reopening the terms of the agreement. I still believe that would have been the better course. And now that our efforts on this side of the Atlantic have not succeeded, it falls to the US administration to spell out their view of the way ahead. In the meantime, I urge the US to avoid taking any action that would hinder other parties from continuing to make the agreement work in the interests of our collective national security. I urge Iran to respond to the US decision with restraint and continue to observe its commitments under the JCPOA. We have always been at one with the United States in our profound concern over Iran's missile tests and Iran's disruptive role in the Middle East, particularly in Yemen and Syria. The UK has acted to counter Iran's destabilizing behavior in the region, and we will continue to do so. We remain adamant that a nuclear-armed Iran would never be acceptable to the United Kingdom. Indeed, Iran's obligation not to seek, develop, or acquire nuclear weapons appears without any time limit on the first page of the preamble to the JCPOA. Yesterday, President Trump promised to work with our allies to find a real, comprehensive, and lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear threat. I have no difficulty whatever with that goal. The question is, how does the US propose to achieve it? Now that the Trump administration has left the JCPOA, the responsibility falls on them to describe how they in Washington will build a new negotiated solution to our shared concerns, a settlement that must necessarily include Iran, China, and Russia, as well as countries in the region. Britain stands ready to support that task, but in the meantime, we will strive to preserve the gains made by the JCPOA, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and let me thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. I'm sure that there will come a time to debate whether the government's approach towards Donald Trump since his election in 2016 has been the right one, but today is not the time. Because instead I believe the whole House, and indeed the whole world, should stand united today in condemning Donald Trump for his reckless, senseless and immoral act of diplomatic sabotage that he has committed. Every independent inspection has confirmed, even the US Defense Secretary James Mattis admitted last month, that the nuclear deal is working and Iran is complying with it in full. And yes, there are other important matters that must be addressed with Iran, its regional activities, its ballistic missile program, and its record on human rights. But the platform for that dialogue, the foundation on which future arrangements could be reached, was the nuclear deal. Instead, by seeking to scupper the nuclear deal, Donald Trump has destroyed the platform for future progress and risked triggering a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, handing power to the hardline theocrats in Tehran and pushing Iran back into isolation. Donald Trump is taking all those risks without a single care, without the slightest justification, and without the simplest rational thought as to what will come next. And in doing so, he is also sending a message to North Korea that any agreement they reach with the US will be worthless. And while we could talk all day about the recklessness and the idiocy of what Donald Trump has done, the key question is this: how should the world react? And here I believe there are three challenges. Firstly is the challenge for those other signatories of how to best preserve the deal. For Britain, France, Germany, China and Russia, this means putting urgent legal and financial protection for companies and banks in our countries engaged in trade and financial transactions with Tehran so that they can continue doing so. And for Iran, they must have the patience and resolve not to respond in kind to this act of belligerence, but continue working with the other signatories to try and keep this deal alive. The second challenge is equally serious, but which is how to stop a descent into conflict. Iran is a country 9 times the size of Syria, with a population as big as Germany's. The idea of Iran racing to develop a nuclear weapon and the US administration seeking to stop them through military means doesn't bear thinking about. And yet we know that this is exactly what the Trump administration are thinking about. In February, the New York Times published an important comment piece accusing the Trump administration of employing exactly the same playbook used before the Iraq War to manufacture a pretext for war with Iran. This was written by Lawrence Wilkerson, former chief of staff to the US Secretary of State Colin Powell, who warned simply, "I helped sell the false choice of war once, it's happening again." And that was even before the appointment of John Bolton. So while we rightly focus our efforts now on trying to salvage the nuclear deal, we must also be alert to stop any further steps that the US may take to escalate its confrontation with Iran. The third and final challenge, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to mention today is, I believe, equally profound. Because if we did not know it before, what yesterday's announcement confirmed is that as long as Donald Trump remains president, we must get used to a world without American leadership. A world where efforts to secure peace and progress on the greatest challenges facing the planet must be made, not just without American cooperation, but often in the face of this administration's active opposition. And this is the challenge we now face in relation to Iran, as it has been on climate change, the refugee crisis, and the Israel-Palestine peace process. But starting with the consensus in this House today, I hope that we can all play our part in ensuring Britain rises to that challenge.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful, actually, for the right honourable lady's point that there's no merit in any reckless and counterproductive attacks on the United States today, and I'm sure she will continue that spirit when the President makes his visit in July, and I trust she will communicate that to the rest of the Labour benches and indeed to the Labour Party in London. I think she made a very good point when she said that today the Iranian government, the Iranian people have not walked away from this deal. They remain in compliance, and it is our duty as the UK government and with our European partners to help them to remain in compliance and indeed to assist in the survival of the JCPOA. I think, to be fair to the US administration, they have decided that there is another way forward. They've decided that the problems that the limitations that they see in the deal, the sunset clauses, Iran's malign behaviour in the region, the problem of Iranian acquisition or intended acquisition of ICBMs, they decided those can be met by bringing all the problems together and having a big negotiation. We have a different view. The UK government has long since taken a different view, that the essence of the JCPOA was to compartmentalise, to take the nuclear deal and solve that. The President has taken another view. As I say, it's now up to Washington to come forward with concrete proposals about how exactly they intend to bring those problems together and to address them collectively. But I think our posture should be one of support in that endeavour, though, as I say, we have been sceptical about how it is to be. As for North Korea, I may say that I think the whole House will want to wish the President of the United States every possible success in his endeavours in North Korea and convey to him, I think, the admiration for the vigour with which he has tackled the matter.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend will know from his own work that US leadership has often been a force for good in this world. And though many of us do still support the leadership the United States does show around the world, many of us are still concerned at their withdrawal from this deal. We are perhaps, however, a little bit more concerned by the malign activity of the Iranian regime, its theocrats, its acolytes, and its useful idiots around the world who have encouraged it and supported it on the media and indeed in the region. Would he agree with me that it is incumbent upon us, as good Europeans, as good internationalists, to work with partners around the world and around the region, not just to encourage a new deal, a new approach to a peace process in Iran, but actually to encourage the Iranian regime itself to change and to become a good neighbour and not a malign influence, and to cease threatening our friends and allies, such as those countries in the region and, of course, Israel?
I think that my honourable friend is entirely right to point to, I'm sure members on both sides will agree, that Iran is a malign actor in the region. In Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria and Iraq, there is no question that Iran has been a seriously disruptive force. And he's right to point out the cardinal importance in these discussions of the Iranian people. And ultimately, that was the effort of the JCPOA, to give them the prospect of economic benefits, of participating in the global economy in exchange for denuclearization. And that is still the fundamental bargain that is there to be struck.
Stephen Gafford.
Deputy Speaker, and thanks to the Foreign Secretary for early sight of his statement. Mr Deputy Speaker, can I also wish you and all members of the House a very happy Europe Day today? And this is a good illustration. We wish everybody a happy Europe Day on both sides of the House, of course. The JCPOA has illustrated the importance of our relationship with our European partners, who are, after all, our closest allies.
Still in the deal.
This work also illustrates the painstaking work that goes into seeking a diplomatic way forward, and the Foreign Secretary was right to point out in his statement about the reduction in low-enriched uranium and some of the other achievements of the Iran deal as well. And the Shadow Foreign Secretary was right in her remarks to talk about the false choice of war. And although this has been a long process, a painstaking process, and I pay due credit to officials and to ministers on both sides of the House for their work over the years on this, it shows that this is a much more effective way of dealing with concerns over weapons of mass destruction than, say, that deployed in Iran's neighbours, for example. I also wonder if the Foreign Secretary agrees with me that this move by President Trump was one that was deeply reckless and a responsible move that has undermined the process and undermined the importance of the diplomatic process. Can you also tell me, given the UK's what appears to be the UK's lack of influence and the Foreign Secretary's appeal as part of this to go on the President's favourite TV show, does this not illustrate even more why we have such an important relationship with the EU in tackling this issue? Yep. And will he tell me when he next plans to meet Federica Mogherini, who's shown such leadership on this issue?
Well, I'm grateful. We work, as the honourable gentleman knows very well, not only hand in glove with the United States, but of course also with our allies and friends and partners in continental Europe. And indeed, that work has intensified over the last few months, because I think, as the Prime Minister has said herself many times, we may be leaving the EU. We're not leaving Europe. As for Federica Mogherini, I expect I shall probably see her next week.
Stephen Craft.
While there are many across the House who will want to continue to give the benefit of the doubt to the Foreign Secretary about the Iran deal, does he nevertheless acknowledge that there remain serious questions about what our wider policy of engagement towards the Iranian regime is actually achieving? Has my right honourable friend seen anything at all in the last 2 years to indicate to him that Iran is taking steps towards becoming a more responsible member of the international community and not a force for chaos and terror that it continues to be?
As my right honourable friend knows very well, the UK is in the lead in trying to disrupt malign Iranian behaviour in the region, whether it is trying to stop Iranian missiles going to Yemen, or indeed to supply Hezbollah in Lebanon. The UK is doing, and indeed of course there are sanctions, as I'm sure he knows full well, on the entire IRGC, which we maintain in this country. We are determined simultaneously to bear down on Iranian malign activity, Madam Deputy Speaker, but we believe we can do that whilst retaining the core achievement of the JCPOA.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that one of the most serious consequences of President Trump's decision, which we note the special relationship was unable to prevent, is that it will result in hardliners in Iran and elsewhere saying there is no point in doing deals on security with the United States of America because they do not keep their word?
All the more reason for the, if the right honourable gentleman is correct, that all the more reason for the UK to work to preserve the essentials of the deal, and just remind the House, who may be getting into a mood of, I think, undue pessimism, the United States, President Trump has said himself last night that he is committed to finding a new solution, and we should hold him to his word.
Richard Bacon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, given that one of the essential elements of the deal is for Iran the restoration of commercial banking relationships in return for adherence to the JCPOA, and this is mentioned in the JCPOA, and since Iran has adhered to the JCPOA, but we've still seen no sign of it, will the Foreign Secretary meet with me and other members of the Iran All-Party Group who have already met the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England to discuss this, to find a way of producing a non-dollar financial arrangement that works so that Iran can retain some credence in the other partners to the JCPOA.
We have seen deals that can, Deputy Speaker, deals that can be done without conflicting with the extraterritorial aspects of US sanctions, and as I said in my statement earlier on, we will be announcing further steps in due course.
Sir Vince Cable.
Now that the government has discovered the limits of sycophancy in dealing with President Trump, can the Foreign Secretary spell out some of the economic implications? Can he say, first of all, if the government has any contingency plans to protect British industry and motorists if the withdrawal of 4 million barrels a day of Iranian oil results in an inevitable oil shock?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Right Honourable Generals know that the UK remains a party to the JCPOA. We will do our utmost to protect UK commercial interests.
Kenneth Clark.
Madam Deputy Speaker, may I first of all congratulate the Foreign Secretary for his unswerving loyalty to collective government policy at the dispatch box this afternoon. Does he agree with me that one of the many dangers from the President's decision is that the so-called moderates in Iran, albeit they're not very moderate by our standards, will be undermined by this decision, and that will strengthen even more hardline people? So when he is therefore looking at the next steps, whilst he may take steps to try to reduce the malign behaviour of Iran in some areas, will he give an unswerving commitment that Britain will stick to its commitments under this agreement so long as the Iranians are fully compliant with the commitments that they've entered into, and that we're not going to modify that in any way?
I thank my right honourable friend, and I remember getting a lot of wonderful copy when I was a reporter, political journalist, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the own displays of unswerving loyalty to government policy on the matter that my right honourable friend used to display. And by the way, I'm completely in conformity. I'm completely in conformity with government policy on the matter, I believe, which he is referring, since that policy has yet to be decided. But on his wider point, it is absolutely vital that we continue to get over to the moderates in Iran. I include President Rouhani in their number, that the UK remains committed to this agreement.
Mike Gapes.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister earlier and the Foreign Secretary now have both praised the joint efforts that have been made with our French and German partners. In the light of the impetuous, destructive, unilateralist behaviour of the US President, isn't this the worst possible time to be leaving the European Union?
I think no. I think what this shows, on the contrary, to the meanest intelligence, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that you don't have to be a member of the European Union in order to cooperate in the most productive way with our European friends and partners.
It's Michael Fallon.
His analysis of this rather flimsy agreement that should never have been called comprehensive, and that it does not include missiles, and far from constraining Iranian behaviour, has actually enabled the Iranian regime to use its new financial freedom to interfere in Syria, in Iraq, above all in Yemen, and to sponsor further Houthi attacks on our friends in Saudi Arabia.
Well, I'm grateful for my right honourable friend that I don't recall him making those points when he served so well as Secretary of State for Defence when the deal was done. But I disagree with him, because I think that the advantage of the JCPOA, and of course it has limitations. Of course it has limitations, as I readily conceded. But at the heart of it, there is an idea to stop the Iranians from acquiring a nuclear weapon in exchange for limited economic benefits. And that idea, I still think, has validity, and the Iranians are still in compliance with that agreement, limited though it is.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm disappointed with the statement today because it wasn't a big surprise that this was going to happen, and yet the Secretary of State, Foreign Secretary, says that we'll come back with some details later on. I don't know why that's the case, because it was even signposted during the American election. So I'm disappointed with that point of view, and also it's light on in statements. It's light on the fact about what we're going to do about the Iranians and their behaviour in the Middle East. And I really think the Foreign Secretary needs to tell us now when he intends to come back to the House.
Well, as I've said several times, or at least twice now, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will be informing the House in due course about what further economic steps we will be taking, and I've been very clear about the many things we're doing in the wider Middle East to constrain the activities of Iran.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Would my right honourable friend agree that whilst there is no doubt that Iranian interference in Syria, Yemen, Lebanon, Bahrain and elsewhere is a very legitimate cause for concern. But will he agree with me that this is a very poor decision by the President, and it flies in direct controversial advice from his own people and from his America's most loyal allies? But will he work in trying to sustain this agreement to ensure that the inspection regime, which is, after all, at the end of the day, the crown jewels of what this agreement was about, will still apply?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. Yes, of course, we will work to ensure that the inspection regime continues. I think there have been about 400 inspections since the JCPOA began, and they have all found that Iran was in compliance. And as I say, it is up to the United States now. It is up to the United States now to come forward with a plan. And if they have military options, frankly, I have yet to see them.
Madeleine Moon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What discussions will the Foreign Secretary and the other members of the E3 be having with NATO allies, since clearly they also will be feeling greatly disturbed at this unilateral action by the United States, and it will impact on their relationships with Iran? Can the Foreign Secretary explain that, please?
I'm sure it will be that the issue will figure largely at the next meeting of the North Atlantic Council.